I could never understand why a God of love would have someone offer up their son, their only son, as a sacrifice. Now, I think I understand. We're continuing our examination of the life of Christ and others from the perspective of living in a crucible. What is a crucible? In ancient times, a crucible was used as a container for melting or testing metals. Symbolically, a crucible is the trials we experience as we grow and develop. Crucibles are painful, they're uncomfortable, they hurt, but they are beneficial in developing our character. It was never God's plan for us to live in a sinful world and go through pain and suffering. He created us to live in a perfectly happy world. But to test our loyalty to Him, He also created the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And at it, He gave Adam and Eve the opportunity to express their freedom of choice and to show their love and loyalty to Him by obeying His commands. Consequently, their freedom of choice has placed us in a world filled with pain, sorrow, and grief. It placed us in a battle between good and evil. It is now up to us individually to choose which side of this battle we want to be on. Moreover, understanding that this battle exists help us better to deal with the pains, sorrows, heartaches, and griefs while living in a crucible. Holy Father, give us the faith and confidence that Abraham had. When we hear your voice, help us to move forward, obeying your voice above all others. Let not our connection with friends and family, our former habits and associates interfere with the purpose that you have for us. In Jesus' name, amen. Abraham was given a difficult test. It was like a pop final exam. It came with no warning. It was as if God told him to obtain the supplies he needed at the very last minute to take an exam to demonstrate just how much faith he had in him. Genesis 22, 1 through 19 describes the test. Here we find that God asked Abraham to give him Isaac, his own son, as a burnt offering. What was a burnt offering? It was a sacrifice, typically an animal sacrifice. It was called a burnt offering because it was totally consumed by fire and regarded as ascending to God as it is consumed. So rather than have Abraham sacrifice an animal, God requested that Abraham sacrifice his son as a whole burnt offering. Can you imagine how Abraham felt when God gave him the instructions to sacrifice his son? Why does a holy God ask his loyal followers to kill his own son? Besides, what about God's promise? God promised to make Abraham the father of many nations. How can this promise happen without his son? That would interfere with him keeping his promise. So why does God ask Abraham to give him Isaac as a burnt offering? What important lesson could God want Abraham to learn from this difficult test? Though it may have seemed like a pop exam or some random test, Patriarchs and Prophets lets us know that it was not. God's request and its timing were not random. Indeed, it was calculated to exact and the deepest possible anguish. For God had reserved his last, most trying test for Abraham until the burden of years were heavy upon him and he longed for rest. Was this test of an angry God? No, not at all. Patriarchs and Prophets goes on and explains that the agony which he endured during the dark days of that fearful trial was permitted that he Abraham might understand from his own experience something of the greatness of the sacrifice made by the infinite God for man's redemption. When Isaac had grown to be a young man, God decided to test Abraham's loyalty. One night, he called him, Abraham. Abraham answered, Yes, Lord, here I am. God said, Take your son, the only one you have, the one you love so much, and go with him 3 days. Travel to Mount Moriah. There at the top of the mountain, I want you to offer up Isaac to me as a human sacrifice. Confused and pained over such a command, Abraham nevertheless obeyed. He quietly woke up his 2 young servants and told them to load some donkeys with food, water, and wood. Then, even more quietly, so as not to wake Sarah, he woke up Isaac, and long before sunrise, they were on their way to Mount Moriah. After 2 painful days and a night wrestling with his conscience, on the third day, Abraham saw in the distance Mount Moriah, the mountain to which God had sent him. Later that day, when they got to the base of the mountain, Abraham said to his servants, Stay here with the donkeys while Isaac and I go to the top and offer a sacrifice to God. We'll be back later. After going over and over the promise of God had made to him that he would have descendants, Abraham had come to the point where he had total confidence that God would solve the problem by raising Isaac from the dead. So he took the wood and put it on Isaac's back while he carried the sacrificial knife and the live coals for the fire, and they started up the mountain. As they climbed, Isaac said, Father? Abraham answered, Yes, my son. Isaac questioned, We have the wood and the fire, but where is the lamb? Abraham replied, God will provide one, my son. So the 2 of them silently walked up the mountain together. Finally, they reached the top together. They found some stones and arranged them to build an altar and put the wood on the top. Then Abraham told Isaac what God had said. Though sad, Isaac saw it as a privilege to give up his life for God while he was young. He let Abraham tie his hands, and then he willingly lay down on the altar. Abraham offered a prayer, then trembling raised the sacrificial knife high above his head so that he could bring it down with the force to quickly end his son's life. At that moment, the Lord called out, Abraham. He turned and answered, Yes, Lord, here I am. The Lord said, Stop. Do not hurt the young man. You have proven your loyalty to me in the sight of the whole universe, because you have not held back your only son, whom I know you dearly love. Abraham wept for joy, untied Isaac's hands, then saw a ram caught by his horns in some thorn bushes. Quickly they got the animal, and Abraham offered the sacrifice God had provided in the place of his son. So Abraham named the place Jehovah Jireh, meaning the Lord sees and provides. Ever since then, people have called that place the mountain where the Lord provided. Then the Lord said to Abraham, I swear by my own name that I will bless you because you listened to me and in your heart offered up your only son as a sacrifice, no matter how painful it was to you. I promise to multiply your descendants until they are as numerous as the stars of heaven or the sands along the seashore. They will conquer the cities of their enemies, and from your offsprings will come the seed who will conquer death. Through him, all the nations on earth will be blessed. The seed will come from your lineage because You have trusted and obeyed me." Then Abraham and Isaac made their way down the mountain to where the servant were, and together went back to Beersheba, where they lived. This experience, as awful as it may seem, was only a test. God never intended for Abraham to kill his son. This test shows us something very important about the way God works. God may ask us to do something that he never intends for us to complete. He may ask us to go somewhere he never wants us to arrive at. What's important to God is not the end, but what we learn in the process. Temptation and trials are designed to develop and strengthen us. What is temptation? It is the means by which those who claim to be the children of God are tested and tried. We read that God tempted Abraham, that he tempted the children of Israel. This means that he permitted circumstances to occur to test their faith and to lead them to look to him for help. God permits temptation to come to his people today, that they may realize that he is their helper. If they draw nigh to him when they are tempted, he strengthens them to meet the temptation. But if they yield to the enemy, neglecting to place themselves close to their almighty helper, they are overcome. They separate themselves from God. They do not give evidence that they walk in God's way. What would have happened? What would have happened if Abraham had failed his test? Abraham's test was the most severe that God could give to a human being. Had he failed under it, he would never have been registered as the father of the faithful. Had he deviated from God's command, the world would have lost an inspiring example of unquestioning faith and obedience. This lesson was given to shine down through the ages, that we may learn that there is nothing too precious to be given to God. It is when we look upon every gift as the Lord's to be used in his service that we secure the heavenly benediction. Give back to God your entrusted possession, and more will be entrusted to you. Keep your possessions to yourself, and you will receive no reward in this life and will lose the reward of the life to come. More importantly, the offering of Isaac was designed by God to prefigure the sacrifice of his son. Isaac was a figure of the Son of God who was offered as a sacrifice for the sins of the world. God desired to impress upon Abraham the gospel of salvation to men, and in order to make the truth a reality and to test his faith, he required Abraham to slay his darling Isaac. All the agony that Abraham endured during that dark and fearful trial was for the purpose of deeply impressing upon his understanding the plan of redemption for fallen man. This seems to be the point Jesus was making when he said in John 8:56, "Your father Abraham was filled with joy at the thought of seeing my day. He saw it and was glad." You see, because of his obedience, God allowed Abraham to see his day. He was allowed to see the day when Jesus arrived upon this earth. Abraham could have missed out on this insight, dismissing the instructions as from Satan. Abraham knew that God asked him to give his son. He knew his voice. This is significant to us because we must know God's voice for ourselves to be sure he is the one directing us. How do you know God's voice? It is the same as you know the voice of your parents, your children, your spouse, friend, or family. You talk to them and you listen as they talk to you. To know God's voice We must be in the habit of talking to him and listening when he talks back to us. We do that through his word, the Bible. Abraham was not the only one who was given a difficult major exam. Although he was not asked to sacrifice his son, Hosea lived in a crucible. What was his crucible? Find out in part 3, Wayward Israel.